The Spitfire is a legend. Today, 60 years after it first entered service with the RAF, it still turns heads and raises emotions with its classic lines and the full-throated roar of its Merlin engine. But the Spitfire was more than just a good-looking aircraft. It was a killer, a fighter of immense character that became the chosen mount for many of the best fighter pilots the RAF could muster. But perhaps most important of all, the Spitfire's design allowed it to be developed constantly throughout its 10 years of manufacture. Bigger engines, more power, and improved armament kept the Spitfire in the front line well after its contemporaries had disappeared. It is not surprising, therefore, that every fighter to carry the RAF roundels since the war has been compared with the Spitfire. The genesis of the Spitfire's success lay in the abilities and leadership of two men. R.J. Mitchell, the chief designer of supermarine aviation, and Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce engines. Their relationship had begun during the preparation for the 1929 Schneider Trophy race. Air racing was hugely popular, and the Schneider Trophy was the blue ribboned event in the racing calendar. Mitchell and Royce set out to create a world beater. The Supermarine S6 won that year, and in 1931 the S6B completed the trio of wins needed to secure the trophy for Britain forever. Three factors were significant in this win. First, the 1931 victory was accomplished without any government backing. Lady Houston, the widow of a shipping magnate, stepped in and donated £100,000 from her own pocket. Second, Mitchell had almost single-handedly brought the concept of the monoplane to the forefront of British aircraft design. Finally, and most worrying to the RAF, the S6B had won the race at a speed of 340 miles an hour and went on to break the world speed record just a few days later. At 407 miles an hour, this streamlined monoplane, powered by a privately built engine, had flown around 200 miles an hour faster than the RAF's fastest frontline fighter.
It left us with the design and aerodynamic knowledge to go on to high-speed aircraft. And of course from that, the Spitfire finally evolved.
Since the First World War, Britain's defence budgets had been small. Hugh Trenchard, the RAF's first commander, had spent his precious pounds on building a bomber force at the expense of fighters. This had stood him in good stead throughout the 1920s, when the RAF had virtually been in control of policing the British Empire. Trenchard, however, did understand the need for fighters. Light biplane bombers had quelled local uprisings in India and Iraq with ease, and it seemed that there was no need for faster and more expensive aircraft. But in the early 1930s, Europe was far from being a continent at peace. In Germany, Adolf Hitler came to power, pulled out of the Geneva Disarmament Conference, and declared that he would rebuild the Luftwaffe. In comparison to Britain, Hitler spent enormous sums of money on new aircraft and pilot training. The German civil airline, Lufthansa, and German gliding clubs had already become breeding grounds for the pilots who would spearhead the Blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, the RAF was resting on its laurels and undertaking exercises with lumbering heavy bombers, which could easily penetrate the fighter defences at 80 miles an hour. If Britain was to have any chance in a war with Germany, then something had to happen quickly. On the 21st of October 1933, Winston Churchill spoke to the House of Commons. Germany is already well on her way to become, and must become, incomparably the most heavily armed nation in the world, and the nation most ready for war. We cannot have any anxieties comparable to the anxiety caused by German rearmament. In response to this, and the obvious warlike posture of Adolf Hitler, the British government gradually increased the defence budget. Equally important was the appointment of men such as Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding to positions of authority. He, amongst others, believed that not only could the bomber be stopped, but must be stopped. While the design of new monoplane bombers continued apace, he also pushed for new fighters. By 1933, Mitchell was already well advanced with the design of a new monoplane fighter in response to an Air Ministry specification. His entry was a gull-wing monoplane with a fixed undercarriage and open cockpit. It was powered by a Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine which used a complicated steam cooling device. But Mitchell was not happy. The Air Ministry ordered a biplane, the Gloucester Gladiator, and Mitchell went back to the drawing board. As Mitchell contemplated revolutionary design features to his airframe, so Rolls-Royce were designing a new privately funded engine, the PV-12. Using the research that had made the Schneider engine so successful, Rolls-Royce built a classic. New chemicals improved the fuels, and better fuels improved the superchargers. This meant that the engine could provide extra power at altitudes where normal engines ran out of steam in the thin air. New, stronger metals meant that the power could be sustained, but at a fraction of the weight. The V-12 inline layout was liquid-cooled, dispensing with the complex steam cooling assembly. In its initial form, the PV-12 had a power output of around 1,000 horsepower, a radical improvement on other military engines of the day. All these factors combined to give a revolutionary power-to-weight ratio, perfect for the new monoplane fighter prototypes under construction. This new engine would soon be named the Merlin. Another great designer had also tendered for the F-730 specification and failed. Hawker's chief designer Sidney Cam had therefore decided to rip up the specification and work on a new monoplane fighter also to be powered by the PV-12. But there the similarity with Mitchell stopped. Cam's bottom line was to design a fighter that could utilize many of the jigs and tools that had been used to build the classic Hawker biplanes, the Hart light bomber, and the Fury and Demon fighters. What he came up with was the Hurricane, a classic in its own right, but an aircraft that was traditionally built with wood and fabric, and that would not stand further development. Mitchell, on the other hand, was creating an aircraft that would use new and complex manufacturing techniques. An all-metal monocoque, which held the pilot's seat and controls, was built as a separate section, with a metal engine housing in front and a metal tail section to the rear.
Well, it's amazing to see how well built they were. I mean, they were built in enormous quantities, and the production of them was organised on the lines of the motor industry. It was all made of sub-assemblies that were all put together on the production line, and where parts didn't fit, there was a number of other parts in the production line or in the parts bin that you would actually put on and would fit. And we do find that from time to time, that some of the parts aren't interchangeable, but there's always enough bits around to get over the problem. But the workmanship, by and large, was pretty good, because it all had to be inspected before the aircraft was accepted by the RAF. It had to be inspected and passed off, so there was a certain standard they had to meet.
The most radical departure of all, though, was the wing. It was made of steel girders of different lengths which slotted into one another. Therefore, at the wing root, where most of the strength was needed, the spar was thickest. As the wing reached the tip, the spar got thinner and lighter. Similarly, the leading edge of the wing was covered in thick metal, which became thinner towards the trailing edge.
Well, there were two things that were special about the wing. First of all, it was quite a thin wing, as wings went in those days. Reginald Mitchell was a genius when it came to that, because it made the Spitfire an extremely fast aircraft. The second major point with the wing was the elliptical shape. Now, that was done specifically to accommodate the 4 guns on either side, and the elliptical shape enabled you to spread the 4 guns across the wing, and you had the depth behind the main spar to accommodate the guns.
However, the wing spar itself was a nightmare to manufacture.
A nightmare to produce, because all the tubes had to slot one inside the other, and then the wing was cranked. There was a bend put in the wing about a couple of feet from the root, and this was pressed in, but once that had been done, you couldn't take the tubes apart. And this is where the first problem comes, because when you take an aircraft wing to pieces and you want to inspect the main spar tubes, because of the crank in the wing, you can't get the tubes apart. And the likelihood is that today, 60 years after they were made, that all the wing spars are corroded. And most spars that are taken to pieces, although they may look okay when you look at them from the outside, if you take them apart, if you saw them apart, usually you'll find corrosion inside. So today, it's normal practice to re-spar the wings.
Supermarine's lack of resources meant that most of the sections had to be put out to manufacture at other companies, causing constant headaches for the assembly teams at the Supermarine factory. On the 6th of March 1936, the new aircraft flew for the first time. The pilot, Mutt Summers, was happy with the first flight, but much work was still needed before the aircraft would be battle-ready. That night, Summers and Supermarine test pilot Jeffrey Quill flew to Brooklands. In the hangar there was the prototype of the Hurricane, which had flown just 4 months earlier. Both aircraft had begun the process that would make them world beaters. The timing of the first flight was somewhat ironic, as the next day Hitler's troops entered the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, his first defiant act against the rest of the world. The clock had begun to tick towards war. The new aircraft was called the Spitfire, the name originally chosen for the unsuccessful gull-wing monoplane. Mitchell himself did not seem happy with the name, but he was aware that the aircraft was going to be a success. He would not, however, live to see his creation fulfill its destiny. Mitchell died from cancer in 1937, leaving a legacy which would make him recognized as one of the greats of the aviation industry. Mitchell's place as chief designer was taken by Joe Smith, who had previously been head of the structures department. He set about turning the aircraft from a prototype into a service fighter.
Under Joe's guidance, the weight of the airplane more or less doubled. The engine power doubled. Its speed went up by nearly 50%. And other aspects of performance improved, a rate of roll and rate of climb and things like that. All improved because they had to. I mean, we had to keep in front of the enemy all the time.
In June 1936, Supermarine received an order for 310 Spitfires, the biggest contract in the company's history. A production line was set up at Woolston in Southampton, and the first production aircraft began leaving the factory in June of 1938. By this time, the Spitfire's performance had been fully developed. Powered by a Merlin II engine, it could achieve a top speed of 362 miles an hour and climb at 2,500 feet per minute to a ceiling of 32,000 feet. This put it at the forefront of military aviation technology. The first squadron to receive Spitfires was number 19 at Duxford, but the production line was slow. It was originally intended to get all the first 310 aircraft in service by March 1938. However, the production problems meant that only 2 squadrons were operational by the beginning of 1939. That year, a further 8 squadrons were equipped, bringing the total to 10 by the outbreak of war. Student pilots couldn't wait to get their first experience of the new aircraft.
When you get into a car, you strap yourself in. Well, you're strapped into a car. When you climbed into a Spitfire, you strapped the Spitfire onto you, and you became part of the Spitfire, and the Spitfire became part of you.
2 surprises. One was that you'd been trusted to take this single-seater fighter